Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Blade 2. So, ultimately, if you guys did not know, I had previously reviewed, of course, the very original Blade. Now I'm going into the sequel. Maybe eventually, at some point, I will eventually review Blade Trinity, which ultimately a lot of people might be like, no! Some people might not have liked that movie. Some people like me might have just liked it regardless, just because of how vastly different that was compared to other things. Reasonably, I like the approach of this movie. We end up having a genetically enhanced vampire species that is kind of knocking off vampires off the food chain, and so we end up having it to where ultimately the vampires are going to have to make a truce with Blade the Daywalker to ultimately have them fight together to go up against this new threat. Ultimately, mostly called Reapers, but we end up having it to where these new branch of vampires are very much enhanced to the point to where ultimately instead of having normal fangs, their basically entire mouth down ends up unhinging and opening and ultimately launching at somebody and just sucking the life out of them through a different kind of means and stuff along those lines. It seems that ultimately these new batch of vampires are assessingly much stronger than the other vampires, and so on and so forth. And it also seems that these new batch of vampires, these reapers, can ultimately turn a vampire into a reaper. So, very much interesting. And plus, it seems like these reapers can multiply a heck of a lot quicker than vampires would, because ultimately that is the reaper goal, is to multiply, uh, making it to where this could be a very incredible task to otherwise take these things down, because they are severely hard to be able to put a stake through. It's not going to work to try to put a wooden stake through this bad boy. Not quite going to work that well. We end up having it to a reasonably. Even when the head of one of these reapers are to be dead, the body is still trying to feed upon itself to try to find blood somewhere. I thought that was really fascinating. Other than that, I think it's really kind of interesting how we could invest in almost everyone in this movie. We can invest in Blade, ultimately trying to be able to outsmart quite possibly the vampires. We can honestly root for the vampires because ultimately they are to eventually, one by one, eventually probably get killed. We are to also root for the villain Nomak, who ultimately is kind of just a guy that ended up getting tossed out to the street to be orphaned out to be able to want to just seek revenge of basically being casted out and seeking revenge to ultimately be the goal of like, well, like the day of the vampire is over. Like, if, yeah, so it's a very vastly interesting story. We also end up having to figure out what ended up happening to Whistler towards the tail end of the very first movie. If you don't know what happens to Whistler in the very first movie, go ahead and check that out. Give yourself a recap, and then come back here. Um, Really, I was kind of excited at the fact that ultimately we have Norman Reedus in this movie. I'm like, yeah, so if ultimately Norman never actually does a Marvel movie, we could ultimately just say, like, well, but he was in Blade 2. Because, man, like, I think Norman Reedus would be great as a Marvel character. The only problem is, who is he going to be? Like, really, a lot of people could say it's like, well, yeah, but, like, I don't ever want to see Norman Reedus in another comic book thing. Some people might just say, like, no, like, have Norman Reedus consistently do Walking Dead stuff, and that's all. That's all I'm fine with. Um, But I don't know. I'd like to see Norman eventually with the MCU basically doing a new Blade. I would like to be able to say, okay, well, Norman Reedus could be fair game to be in any number of MCU like projects, considering they've worked with him before. Anyways, excuse me. Anyways, I like this movie. Reasonably, when looking at it, it's a means for me to get from Blade 1 to Blade 3, if anybody doesn't like it. Um, so, honestly, just me reviewing this one is just to get to Blade Trinity. So, when looking at it, some people might hate this movie. Some people might enjoy it, or some people might go, "Ugh, like this movie's kind of gross." This movie's got a different kind of spectrums for different folks. So let's go into that double five timed territory to otherwise branch out into eventually, without a doubt, going into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So we have it to where ultimately Blade really, all that really matters to him is eventually trying to retrieve Whistler. We end up having it to where Blade is to get information from seemingly some Russian-esh like person, and ultimately he is to let him go via after uh, this guy's squealing. Here's one thing that I noticed. We end up having a guy that is having his head being put next to a wheel, and this motorcycle helmet is to come off. Here's my thing. You could obviously see that the helmet was made to be taken off of this guy. You could see like the little cuts in the helmet to see that easily that this helmet was supposed to go flying off this guy already. You could see the cracks in the helmet, which I thought were interesting. Um, like they could have easily just cut that to where instead of having the whole entire, like they could have ultimately had the helmet perfectly fine towards the wheel and then cut, and then ultimately could have added the broken helmet and then gotten closer to the wheel and then had the thing fly, and it would have worked a lot better than ultimately just having a one shot thing where you can obviously see the cuts in the helmet and then the helmet comes off. Uh, or they could have CGI'd it and fixed it later on. They could have remade it. Anyways, moving on. So we end up having it to where Wesley Snipes ends up going into this seemingly underground environment where he ends up finding Whistler ultimately in this big like blood tube esh like thing or whatever. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Blade rescues Whistler from this to find out that ultimately Blade has or Whistler has fangs on him, I would assess. So we end up having it to where Whistler is to be brought back to Blade's headquarters, ultimately with Scud, which is Norman Reedus. And so we end up having it to where. Here's one thing that I noticed. I think Scud ultimately at one point had a Hellboy shirt on that ultimately said Scud on it. Ultimately, if anybody catches like this is probably this shirt's kind of in a brief scene or whatever, but I swear there's a Hellboy shirt that ultimately Scud was wearing, and like that had the Hellboy logo on it. Um, I don't know if there was a clear scene that was caught, but when looking at it, I was like, yeah, like it looks like the Hellboy logo is on Scud's shirt. Moving on, so we eventually have it to where ultimately Whistler is to give uh, it or Blade is to give Whistler a concoction that is to basically dry him out to make Whistler kind of being able to work again. And so we end up having it to where Whistler kind of gets back to normal. Ultimately, is to see what had happened to his headquarters, and ultimately to meet Scud, which ultimately he's ending up complaining to Scud about all the modifications that Scud is trying to do that ultimately he does not like things to Blade's vehicle or whatever. So, moving on. We end up having it uh, to where we end up having Scud going and trying to check on his equipment because red flags are going up on his equipment, basically saying there's a breach. We end up having it to where there are two vampires that are making their way to Whistler. Ultimately, Whistler ends up trying to shoot them down, but nothing really happens out of that. Blade ends up going and turning on some lights to ultimately say, "Hey guys, come over here and fight me." We end up having it to where reasonably Blade is getting some pretty good licks in, but he's not really trying. We end up having it to where ultimately they kind of call a truce to ultimately say, "Hey, like we've come for you," to ultimately call a truce. We end up having to where Nisa, the main character girl that ultimately is seemingly almost the love interest of Blade at some point in this movie. We have her and Assad end up going and giving a treaty to Blade. So we end up finding out that ultimately they desperately want to rid themselves of this character Nomak that seems to be going and taking out every little bit of the vampires, because ultimately we end up having it to where Nomak is to go to this hospital to where he is supposed to give blood, um, but instead he ends up taking a bunch from all the people that are there. We end up having it to where there was some druggie or some kind of patient or whatever that ultimately was mentioning about their delivery system for blood. How it's like, dude, man, like they'll take as much blood as you want. They'll even take it from a jar, and it's like, oh my god. So we end up having it to ultimately Blade is to forcibly work with all of these vampires, Chupa, Snowman, Reinhardt, the list goes on, um, Lighthammer, so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Blade is to work with these people, uh, but when looking at it, he wants to be able to let them know it's like, dude, I'm always going to be one step ahead of you. Because we end up having it to where Blade ends up going with the vampires to their headquarters, but ultimately he has an entire. I'm going to pause here for a second. He has an entire leather jacket laced with explosives. So we end up having to where Blade ends up going to the vampire headquarters to be told about Nomak and to be told about that ultimately they're calling a truce. We ultimately find out that ultimately the vampires were trying to be able to uh, re-engineer a new kind of vampire, and it ended up blowing up in their faces. They were trying to rid the weaknesses of all the vampires of course, Silver, and even Sunlight at some point. And ultimately, they end up re-engineering this guy that ultimately again blew up in their faces. So we end up having it to ultimately Blade goes along and ultimately is with the number of these people. And so we end up having it to where it seems that this threat is growing exponentially of the Reapers and Nomak. And so we end up having it to where Blade and this crew are to go to this nightclub of sorts, and we end up having it to where they end up needing to have UV light, like flashlights, that ultimately can seemingly burn vampires. Because ultimately, we end up finding out that that's basically the only weapon that is going to work with these guys. because we end up having it to where reasonably the vampires end up going and shooting these guys full up of silver, but that does jack crap nothing. We end up having it to where eventually one of the Reapers end up going and infecting a character named Priest. And eventually he is to become a vampire. These vampires are basically scrambling because they do not know how to kill these Reapers. They cannot easily figure this out. And so this really just ultimately kills some of these vampires off. And we eventually have it to where Chupa and Reinhardt eventually go and beat the living crap out of Whistler just because they lost man, so Blade needs to lose a man, which ultimately leads them to wanting Whistler to be taken out. So we eventually have Scud, who eventually is outside as a, I guess, getaway van, but eventually we end up finding out the Reapers ending up attacking this van, and Norman ends up crashing his vehicle and ultimately trying to basically re-engineer his vehicle to get the lights to turn back on, so ultimately he could be able to use the UV lights to kill all of these Reapers, because he ends up finding out that's the only way to kill these things. And so we end up finding out that ultimately the vampires are starting to use the UV lights, so that way they can take down these Reapers. And eventually we end up having it to where Blade is almost getting to Nomak and eventually trying to use things that would normally work on vampires aren't exactly working on Nomak. It seems that ultimately we end up having it to where Scud is to give Blade these handheld bomb devices that are to kind of explode a normal vampire. Ultimately doesn't really do anything for Nomak. It kind of just gets it to where ultimately the thing just kind of like really just presses his brain noggin but doesn't do anything else. So we end up having it to where ultimately Blade is like, what the heck do I do? Really, like, I love the fact that we end up having it to where these people just think that they're going to just blow through all these Reapers and it'll be nobody's business. But then when they finally get into this environment, they realize how outmatched or outsmarted they are. And so the otherwise are just like, ah, crap, well, I guess I'm going to die. So we end up having it to where ultimately pushing on, we end up having it to where Whistler ends up going and talking to Nomak. Ultimately, Nomak is giving Whistler a ring to ultimately say, "Hey, man, like I'm actually on your side. Like when looking at it, I'm just misunderstood. There's a story that you aren't getting that I'm going to tell you now. Ultimately, I'll let you live, Whistler, but ultimately, I'm going to tell you this story." So we end up having it to ultimately we end up having Whistler finding this underground like environment where these Reapers um, are simply conjugating or collecting, and so eventually they end up deciding that they're like, hey man, like we're gonna go and like get in here the next time around, because ultimately we end up finding out that Blade is the only one that can go down there because ultimately sunlight. So and the vampires ended up leaving him to ultimately Blade is to go and try to get Nomak, but doesn't work out all that well. So we end up having the vampires and Blade ending up coming back for round two to ultimately come back with a UV light bomb. So we end up having it to where they are to come back. We end up realizing that Lighthammer ultimately had gotten infected by one of these Reapers, and so eventually he is going to at some point turn. Ultimately, to eventually see that turn, where ultimately we end up having Lighthammer end up killing uh, Snowman, and then eventually end up killing what is the uh, the female girl, the girl with the pink or pinkish reddish hair. I don't know. Um, Verlaine? Sure. Sounds good. So, if anything, we go on to here and ultimately have it to where seemingly Reinhardt is to ultimately get a bomb attached to the back of his head by, of course, Blade, because ultimately Reinhardt is the only person that is making stupid jokes about, hey, Blade, do you blush? Ultimately, it seems like Reinhardt is kind of the uh, like it's kind of like the prison scenario. You have the biggest guy, and so ultimately Blade is going as much as humanly possible to knock him down a notch because he's annoyed with him. So we end up having it to where eventually they go down into this sewer, and slowly but surely we start seeing some vampire characters die, and we're like, no, I don't care. And so, the only person that matters at the end of all of this is Blade living. So anybody else is just meh. It's just an interesting part of the movie. So we end up having it to eventually that Reinhardt and I'm just gonna call her Nye, the main girl that ultimately is eventually slowly but surely infatuated with Blade. We end up having Nye and Reinhardt eventually going and realizing that eventually they're going to be outnumbered. Blade eventually goes and tries to protect them and otherwise tries to get these Reapers to surround him by him also using the UV bombs consistently. I really think it's fun when Wesley is ultimately going through these sewers and stuff like that, ultimately going like, you don't know who you're effing with. Ultimately, when you get the TV censor, I think he ultimately says, you don't know who you're messing with. Which ultimately he says the F word, but it is what it is. So we end up having it to where Blade uses the UV bombs, and Reinhardt eventually tries to prep the UV bomb bag, but we end up finding out while Blade is trying to uh, have all these Reapers swarm up to him, and Reinhardt and Nye are otherwise going through the sewers, ultimately trying to evade some of these Reapers. We end up having to Reinhardt ends up telling Blade, "Hey, just letting you know, the bomb bag is stuck. The 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 piece to otherwise get this bomb rolling is stuck." So of course, Blade is the only person that could fix this bomb bag to ultimately it does go off. We end up having it to ultimately Nye ends up realizing that the bomb is going off, and so she ends up ducking into the water to avoid having this bomb going off. We ultimately end up seeing like it's a really interesting thing when we end up seeing Reinhardt and Nye ending up starting to run out of bullets, and we end up having it to where Reinhardt ultimately has these like blade guns, which ultimately kind of doubles as like it's really interesting. So bomb goes off. Ultimately, all of these Reapers end up getting killed off. Sadly, Nomak is not there. It seems that Nomak is the last defense of these new breed of vampires. So we end up having to where Blade ends up finding Nye and ultimately goes and is like, hey, you want a wrist? Would you like some of my hand? He ends up taking his blade, cutting his hand, and giving Nye a little bit of blood. Where ultimately that ends up backfiring because the vampires end up taking a SWAT team in to ultimately tase Blade to ultimately get him to come back with them to their headquarters. So we eventually end up having it to where ultimately Whistler is to tell the guys the story of Nomak, and so ultimately Nye realizes how much her family has basically turned on her. Her father has basically turned on her because her father ultimately um, is Damaskinos. Damaskinos? whatever name of that. So we end up finding out that supposedly Nomak is actually Damaskinos' son, and we end up finding the whole rigmarole. We end up finding all kinds of stuff, and so we end up having it to where ultimately Nomak is going for Damaskinos and his daughter, because ultimately he wants revenge. He wants to sit at the throne which was taken from him, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where Nomak is ultimately going and making his way to this headquarters because Blade ended up helping him track where this is. Because while Blade is ultimately going and getting prepped for getting his blood drained and a bone marrow being taken out, we end up having it to where Blade ultimately is to let the uh, is to ultimately let the doctor like person know that is working on him. Trying to find the name. Uh, I won't be able to find it. The guy with the glasses. That guy. The guy that I think ended up being in the Hellboy movie as the villain. So moving on. We end up having it to where reasonably Blade ends up going and letting them know, hey, Nomak's gonna be here, just so you know. And so everybody's now scrambling to try to fight off Nomak, which they cannot do. And so we end up having Damaskitos and Nye ultimately going and scrambling throughout this building just to avoid Nomak, because they know they're going to die once he makes it to them. So while that is going on, we end up having it to where ultimately Whistler makes his way to ultimately to Blade, uh, and we end up having it to where Whistler ends up going and uh, taking Blade out to um, out to go and get some blood. There's a big giant bathtub of blood that ultimately basically Whistler kind of forces Blade to just kind of trot his way to and fall in and just have a good old bloodbath drinking, I guess. And we ultimately have to where Blade is going to fight off Reinhardt, which is a really good sequence. Ultimately, by the time when Blade is to make it to uh, these headquarters before he is going and basically being an attempt of being dissected and so on and so forth, we end up finding out that Scud ultimately let all the vampires into his headquarters. If we end up finding out that Norman Reedus actually was a familiar all along, and we end up finding out that ultimately the bomb that ultimately was placed uh, on Reinhardt's back of his head was supposedly fake, but Blade was like, no, it's not fake. It's for realsies, not for plays. And so, because we end up having it to where Blade ultimately says, yeah, I knew all along that you were familiar. I knew every single step ahead of everybody before anything was to go off. And guess what? The Blade is not a fake. It's real. And so Norman Reedus ends up just exploding and dying. And so we end up having it to where, like, well, some justice for that, which I thought was hilarious. But yeah, other than that, yeah, it was just kind of interesting to see that kind of scene play out. Because ultimately, it's kind of interesting. Like, I like the fact that we end up having it to where it seems that somebody is going to one up Blade, but Blade is like, no, I will never get one upped. Nobody's ever going to out chess move me. It's not how it's going to happen. Not in my films. Which ultimately I like. That's the one thing that I liked about Superior Spider-Man is Spider-Man would ultimately just like, oh no no no, you think that you got me beat? Sorry, I have this in place just in case. Like I have a contingency plan. That's the one thing that I also liked about Batman is Batman eventually at some points in time would have a contingency plan. That's the thing that I like about these kinds of characters is the intelligence of the otherwise well it has to be a story that somebody has to have a one-upsmanship anyways, but still, I like the intelligence of it. So because it makes for a surprising movie or a surprising show or a surprising comic book. So moving on. So we end up having to where Blade ultimately is to take on Reinhardt and to basically Reinhardt is to eventually go and uh, grab Blade's blade. Like in the very first movie, we end up having to where ultimately someone tries to grab Blade's blade and the blade goes off and ends up cutting their hand. Where in this movie, we end up having it to where ultimately we don't exactly go that route. Um, but anyways, we end up having it to where Reinhardt has Blade's blade, and then eventually Blade ends up getting said blade back. Hilarious, because we end up having to where Blade just kind of outstrong hands Reinhardt to eventually kind of like smack the blade out of his hand to eventually have it to where the blade flies in the air. Blade ends up grabbing his sunglasses, and eventually Blade grabs his blade to ultimately slice Reinhardt in half, to ultimately have him confetti onto the floor, split in half. So we end up having it to where ultimately, while this is all going on, we end up having it to where Nomad is making his way to Dirty Cheetos, the big bad, ugly looking villainish character. And ultimately, we end up having it to where Nomad's father is to basically say like, "Hey, like we could work together, like you and me, it could happen." And ultimately, Nomad is like, "Yeah, that sounds good and all, but it seems like you're saying all this stuff really out of fear instead of out of like admiration or out of like real acceptance. Like you're just saying all this because you don't want to die." And so we end up having it to where ultimately Nomak ends up in a vicious way killing his father by ripping out his throat and killing him. And then eventually we have it to where Nye ends up going and is like, "Hey man, like you already killed my father. You might as well uh, like get the whole entire collection of this whole family going on. Like you might as well take me too, because what am I going to do? How am I going to be able to stop you? How am I going to be able to persuade you? It's not going to work." So Nye ends up giving herself up to her brother, and her brother, of course, just is going to eventually turn her into a Reaper. So Blade ends up strolling in, just like, "Yeah, I ended up just killing a bunch of people. How's it going, Nomak?" "Sounds like you killed a bunch of people too, Nomak. Good for you." So we end up having the most amazing fight out between Blade and Nomak. There's like structures that are getting like tossed over, and Blade's having to like roll over things and flip around and all these kinds of cool, interesting things. We end up having to where Blade ends up breaking Nomak's arm to eventually have him just pop it back into place and then hit freaking Blade with an elbow. There's a lot of aggressive things going on within this fight to ultimately have it to where Nomak is taking like Blade's leg and then just like flinging him around and then like in splattering Blade. It's a really interesting fight. There's even a point where Nomak takes like an elbow to Blade. Like there's a lot of like wrestling slash. There's a lot of stuff going on in this fight, and it's freaking amazing. We end up having at some point Nomak going and flying off to somewhere to drop a foot down onto Blade. Blade ends up moving, and Nomak's foot ends up going like through the floor. Like there's so much interesting things going on with all of this movement. There's not a movement that ultimately doesn't have meaning, and I thought it was fascinating. So we end up having it to where eventually Blade is coughing up blood, like he is getting his butt whooped, and we end up having it to where like Nomak is even kind of relishing in this. He's just kind of like, "Yeah, like hey Blade, like you and me were kind of the same. It's like if anything, like hey, like I can't wait to be able to just turn you and just make you my monkey kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where eventually Blade ends up taking what is left of his blade, and so because the blade ended up getting cut from the handle, and so Blade ends up taking his blade and shoving it into uh, the rib cage of Nomak to try to get it to where ultimately he can perfectly be able to get to the heart of Nomak, because you can't straight up just go right into the heart. You got to kind of like rib cage it. It's like a uppercut like maneuver to get the blade to go in, and so we end up having Nomak going I'm stabbed, and so ultimately we end up having it to where Nomak is like, funny, it's weird, it hurts no more, and so we end up having to where Nomak shoves the blade a little bit further in to ultimately secure that ultimately he is going to die. So we end up having it to where Nomak ends up turning into fiery confetti, and we are basically just like, yeah, Blade won. We end up having it to where Blade ends up kind of like just shrugging off his shoulders at the end of the battle, which I thought was like awesome. Just like, yeah, you ain't got on me. I'm still number one. I'm still Magnum Cum Laude. So, anyways, we end up having it to where ultimately. And here's the thing also, in the very early of this movie, we end up having it to where ultimately they're like, hey, thanks for end up taking out Deacon Frost, because ultimately, like, that was a rival vampire clan of the Dirty Cheetos clan, which ultimately I thought was interesting. I was like, oh, so there is going to be a tie from the first movie to the second movie. Oh, that's nice. Because I never thought there was going to be a tie to the sequel movie. And then when ultimately looking at it, I don't think there was any real true tie from the second movie to the third one. But I guess technically, Whistler, technically being dead, I guess could be. Well, no, I guess he actually dies in the third movie. Yeah, that's true. So, anyways, um, we end up having it to where Blade is to go to Nye, and Nye is like, hey man, I'm feeling a turning. I feel like I'm going to change from blue to red. And so ultimately, Nye ultimately says that she wants to die a vampire instead of dying a Reaper. So we end up having it to where Blade ends up picking her up to have her go outside, to ultimately end up having her turn into fiery confetti, to where the sun is coming up, and ultimately Nye is ultimately just like and then she ends up dying, and then ultimately Blade ultimately gets up to a charcoal woman, and he is to just go off and just try to be Blade again, because ultimately he's regretting the loss of yet another woman. Because ultimately I never knew what happened to the first woman in the first movie. Who knows? So ultimately, that is the tail end of Blade 2, the review. Ultimately, I enjoyed this movie for how different it was. I like that it was, of course, done by Del Toro, which ultimately he had done any number of Hellboys and all Pan's Labyrinth and all kinds of things. So I'm like, so yeah, of course, there has to be like a different approach to vampires and so on and so forth with Del Toro, because like if it was just a straight up supernatural movie, I think that ultimately, when seeing the word Del Toro on the bill of this, would have been just like, I don't know, what was he here for? Did he really just want to do a Marvel movie? And so on and so forth. But anything, I am going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.